Hello, boys.
Good afternoon.
I was just about to text you. Glad to see you here. Everything going okay on your end?
Things are good. Things are
All
good.
right.
Another hot day in the neighborhood.
Yes, sir. Well, I think we're still going to wait. Well, we are still expecting a few other guests, but
Sure. No worries.
is Ellen joining us? Ellen from your office. Sir.
Oh, no, Ellen is not joining us. No.
Oh, all right. Got it. Go ahead, Mark.
Oh, that's an interesting first name. How'd you come by that first name?
It's a family name. And with the last name Olson in Minnesota, my mother wanted a unique name. It was my great uncle's name. And the three boys before me were John, Bob, and Jim. And so when I came along, they decided it was time to mix some things up. It was not a, when I was younger, I didn't care for it. And it's been a blessing and a curse ever since, because there's not very many of us, and there's kind of only one that does what I do. And so therefore, when people say Blois said something, they kind of know who said it. So there you go.
I was going to say, if I did an internet search for you, if I spelled your name right, I'd wind up with you.
Yeah, no, when people say, I haven't seen you in a while, or I was thinking about, I'm like, I'm not hard to find. So yeah, no, I've come to appreciate it.
I am taking images from today's program and putting them on the SBE17.org website, just FYI.
While we wait for additional stragglers to drop in, any other chapter business of note?
I think some people have been wondering when we're going to have our next in-person meeting, and I'm still at the take myself, but we'll wait and see what happens in July times and if things are going well or not. Otherwise, and maybe July won't be good anyway, because everyone's going to be. No, it's August. Everyone's got to start ready for the state fair, so I'm sure that won't be an in-person one for sure.
And I'm hoping we do a picnic sometime. And last discussion, I think it was late in the year, September or something like that.
The last I remember, yeah, it's my take was September time. Well, again, we'll know how things are. If things have calmed down enough, yeah, we can do this pretty painlessly. It'll be a little nicer out weather-wise. Should be. Who knows anymore for that stuff, and we'll have to decide where we'll be able to hold it to.
And one more thing, any of you who have interesting photos that are broadcast related, you could send them to me, the webmaster of SBE17.org, and depending on what you send me, I might put it on the website. I'm always looking for material.
Just to throw a few things out there, to give some specifics on what I was alluding to in that last email. As far as in-person venues go, where we've normally met, obviously don't want to throw anyone under the bus, but iHeart has not set up a conclusive stance one way or the other on how fast they will return. The city of St. Louis Park is probably the best bet. They say they're resuming meetings in person on July 1st without any restrictions. So they are definitely eager to see us. Pollock Museum is reopening at least the exhibits to the public come late July, but as far as actual in-person get-togethers or events, that may not come around until more like July or August. And then there was one other that I'm trying to find. I I've got. No, it'll come back to me. Those were the big ones anyway that we've normally met at before. So it is doable, but it's just one of those things that we have to take on a case-by-case basis. And just because they will allow us to meet there, it doesn't necessarily mean that the speaker for that month would join in person or that there'd be a luncheon involved. Some companies are still being a little more tricky on that particular subject. So to be announced, I would say, is the quick summary there.
I think the Pavic has now completed its renovation. They went through, I guess, of course I haven't been there, but I guess they went through quite a renovation of most of the space. So it'll be interesting to see what they came up with.
Yeah. You know, Sylvie had written me back on June 11th saying she was wrapping things up, and late July was what they were hoping for as far as the public reopening.
Interestingly, COVID was a good thing for them in their renovation. They didn't want people there anyway, and that's how it came out.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right about that. All right. Well, unless anyone has other matters of state, I suggest we hand the reins over to Mr. Olson. Going once, going twice. All right, sir, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Well, thanks, Taylor. Thanks for having me here today. You know, I first and foremost appreciate what you guys are doing. I really appreciate that Joe's like working and listening at the same time here on the ladder. So I'm a big fan of multitasking, but I'll try not to do it during this presentation or this conversation. You know, Taylor just kind of left it to broadband policy, both federal and local, and kind of how that plays into the politics. I try to effectively figure out these intersections with policy, politics, and the public, and where opinions are and where policy is, and what makes one move when it doesn't. So I've got a couple slides to kind of show about broadband and internet, if that makes sense to kind of start with. But I'd really be curious if there's, you know, specific questions, ideas, thoughts that you guys have that that make more sense to discuss. So let me do this and do this. And Taylor, do you want to give me permission to share?
Yep. Right on it right now. You should be the host now.
Yep. So we'll go here and we'll do. So really it's trying to connect dots is the way I think about it. And so what are the dots in politics? What are the dots in your professional world? What are the dots in the public, in the buzz, in the debate that makes people move on issues? And so just a little quick situational awareness here. You know, access and cost are deeply connected to the issues related to, quote, broadband. I'm using that term very liberally. And I think that's one of the opportunities and challenges around policy of, quote, broadband, end quote, because it is a universal term, but it's very different services. You guys probably know way more about that than I do, but you know, the level of regulation, even per service, per federal and state, between cable and traditional landlines, and then high speed, and of course wireless, creates all kinds of different ways in which someone can achieve access through broadband. But the regulatory environment is very, very inconsistent. And as I thought about this topic, you know, I think, you know, there's some politics behind it. But it's like campaign finance reform. Nobody's against more broadband. Nobody's, trying to stop more broadband. But it's like campaign finance reform in that it lacks a passion from the populace. And I think coming out of COVID, we are at probably a passion point unlike before. We engage coverage as a firm on ag issues, healthcare issues, highly regulated industries, and financial services. And in each of those cases, somewhere, somehow in the last few years, they've all wanted to advocate for more broadband. But getting people fired up, excited, in a populist fashion, and Minnesota in particular, but the Midwest is the largely populous states, where if the people don't cry for it, if it's not talked about in the coffee shop or at the bar, it's probably not going to break through. And so if you think about the politics of Minnesota, I'll just start with like the basics. Where you live determined on who you voted for. So here you see that if you lived in a small city or rural area, you were more likely to vote for Donald Trump. And if you were in a suburb, it was fairly evenly split. And if you were in a city of $50,000 or more, you were more likely to vote Democrat. And I say this because I think that the topic of broadband, especially in 2020 and post-pandemic, is one of these issues that has some shared interest between greater Minnesota or rural areas and urban areas. But as you can see here, it's not a top issue. And this is last year's election, and we can kind of, determine there was a lot on people's minds last year, and broadband wasn't one of them. But I would guess that broadband's never been a top 5 issue on voters' minds when they go to the polls. And in fact, when it comes to importance, the economy ultimately was the top issue last year amongst Minnesota voters in an exit poll. And so how do you tie this back? So the things that broadband tie to in the economy would be valuable, but the other things that broadband ties to, i.e. education, small business development, those kinds of things, are much more granular. And so Morning Consult, a firm that we subscribe to, we use a lot of their data. They do broad swaths of public opinion research over time. And this is from a September 2020 poll, so almost a year old now, but strong majorities of voters support expanded access to broadband through congressional action. So again, it's not about the will of the people. The will of the people says expand access. Over 60% thought in September it should be an immediate concern. So there was some urgency. Think about September. People were going back to school online. People were working. Maybe you had 2 parents or 2 kids working on schoolwork or virtually, all on one broadband connection. And in many households, that became a challenge. Then you add in the other layers of COVID, parenting, small children, screen time. And we'll get into this messaging, but there is some support if you message broadband the right way. And then 95% say that access is a problem for students and teachers. So this became very real last year. If you think back, I'm an early adopter. I was an early computer user. I had DSL probably for, probably since the late 90s in one form or another, certainly in an office all of that time. But never before had I thought about it as an education opportunity for my kids until now. And then similarly, in rural areas, it's a problem. but 63% say it's a major problem in rural areas. And that's largely the way it's been talked about, but that has shifted. So it also has moved to top of mind for a discussion point. So majority have heard poor quality internet service during COVID, but less than a fourth have heard it a lot, 39% have heard it a little, and 40% have heard not much or nothing at all. So it was out there. But here's some of the most telling parts of this research from Morning Consult last year about the cost. So when we do messaging, we try to test messages. What message resonates more? And here you have a couple examples of messaging that says, I would be willing to pay a little more to subsidize internet access for those who cannot afford. 5248. I would be willing to pay a little more for internet access to help those who cannot otherwise afford it. 55. So help versus subsidize. Okay. That's the difference there. So people aren't as hot on subsidies as they are on helping. Now, here's the other messages that made people think about it differently. And how do you pay for this? I would be willing to pay a little more to subsidize infrastructure to those living in areas otherwise would not have access. So I'll pay for the infrastructure, but I'm not going to pay the bill. And of course, we all know that the long-term payback on a lot of these rural projects is one of the big hurdles. And then I would be willing to pay a little more for internet access to help in internet infrastructure be deployed is another way. So people are willing to pay a little more for the infrastructure. They're not willing to pay a little more to subsidize. And I think that's one of those things. And then very recent research just this year, Americans, this is a socioeconomic issue, okay? So 76% of people who make less than 30,000 have a smartphone. 59% have a desktop. 57% have home broadband or a tablet or all of the above. And you start to think about, in my world, I have all of the above and then some. And I run the whole business out of my house, and 2 kids have been educated in my house. So that it's a luxury to many people, but you start to see that there are some very big socioeconomic differences on what people can afford that requires or warrants them to have broadband. And then this is, I think, one of the big digital divide issues. And I can talk about some recent examples in public policy that intersecting with the government is key. So, you know, do you have a smartphone? And if that's your only way of going online, what barriers does that create economically? And then, you know, if you're 30 to 99 or 100K or more. So you can see that that is their only way online, and it's only a smartphone. So I call those out as some numbers to discuss because I want to know your points of view. I want to know how you view these issues, what you want people to understand, and how it fits into your jobs. One of the examples I use that I'm sure you can relate to is that I no longer own any sort of broadcast computer or broadcast radio, transistor radio. But I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 smart speakers in my house that play my radio when I need it. And so that takes up broadband. And then finally, ultimately, there's been some new investment. How does it get deployed? What does it mean? And then I would just say the bureaucracy of that deployment, the regulatory environment of speed checks and minimum requirements, creates policy tensions, I know, and those have been around for 25 years that I've worked in and around telco policy. So I don't think those are changing anytime quickly. And I'm guessing most of you guys work on the business side where the regulatory environment is not about the speed and the technology, but as much about the requirements of the FCC. So with that, I'll throw it open. I will take questions, comments. If you guys have points of view that I can try to help connect the dots on, I'd be happy to.
It's Mark Persons here.
Yeah.
A couple of thoughts here. Talking to a doctor the other day who was bitterly complaining that he couldn't get high-speed internet at his home out in the country. My reply was, move to town. Okay. The other comment I have is that if you had to decide if you're at home, you're on the internet, if the power goes out, is that as bad as the internet going out? Which is worse? And what I'm hearing is that when the internet goes out, that's worse than losing the power. What's your thought?
Well, on the first one, I think this is one of the things that I think is a misperception, and it goes back to cost. Now, he's a doctor, so I'm just going to pick on him for a minute. He could get high-speed internet to his house. He'd just have to pay more than he wants to pay for it.
Well, it's a rural area, so
No, I know. But what I'm saying is that ultimately somebody would run the line there if he paid them enough.
Hmm.
And that's one of the pieces that agribusiness has learned. So as technologically sophisticated as agribusiness has gotten, they have found that if they need data transmission, they need access, they figure out how to pay for it, even though they might not be able to just call their local co-op or their provider and say, oh, hey, I want fiber run to my farm. But, oh, look, AT&T has a wireless tower, 3 miles away. I could trench to their tower and then, but it's more than just the way we would think about calling and getting a phone line or setting up a new cell phone. So I think that's one of the pieces. The other thing is, does he think about high speed wireless on a smartphone? I don't know where he is, but would that do it, or is that just not fast enough? And then your second point was what? I'm sorry.
Oh, if the power goes out
Oh,
or
yeah,
the internet goes out, which one is worse?
Well, I actually have lived this a couple times as recently as last Saturday. So we had an interesting power situation here. We had a faulty pole that shifted and threw the power out, but then went back on. And then but only half of my house had power. So literally, this was like one of those, how is this happening? When that shifted, did it blow a circuit? What's the issue? I'm smarter than your average bear when it comes to electricity, but here's what I was thinking. It's a Saturday. If I wait till Monday to figure this out, even though I have half power, my office doesn't have power. And so I'm just going to call somebody and try to get them out here and figure this out. Well, it turned out that one of my two 120 lines from the pole separated, but the other 120 line was fine. Okay. But I was the only guy of 12 houses that this happened to. So an electrician came out, charged me a nice Saturday fee, and then pointed to the pole and said, there's your problem. You have to wait for Excel. But Mark, here's the interesting thing. My internet was out because that part of the house didn't have power. I would have been much better off with having internet on Monday morning than power, because I could totally function work-wise in theory on a tablet or on a laptop that's charged or whatever. So I think people are there. I'd also tell you this, and I don't know how deep into telco policy you get, but full disclosure, I've represented CenturyLink Quest on and off for about 22 years. And did you know that in Minnesota, you have to repair the landline before you repair the DSL?
Landlines, even if they're on fiber, they have battery backups, and it's
Right.
part of the law that requires them to be there 24/7.
Right. But a copper line has to be repaired if it's in the queue. Say there's 20 DSL lines that need to be repaired, and then 5 copper phone lines come in. They immediately go to the top, and even if it's the same house. And so we would argue from a policy standpoint that most people would want their internet fixed sooner than they'd need their copper line fixed, because only 6% of Minnesotans rely solely on a copper line. There you go.
Is there, Steve here, I just want to jump on that. Is there any talk of that being bumped up? Because that is kind of the same, we have DSL here and we get basically the same story. If our DSL line goes down, it's best effort versus the old T1 days when we actually had a quality of service agreement.
So there's a very recent filing at the PUC to change that as it is in our surrounding states that would make it a priority, or make it an equalized priority. So we'll see what the PUC does with it.
Another, go ahead, Mark.
Oh, well, tell us about 5G. I mean, it's where is the state of it in Minneapolis and out state?
Well, it seemed, I'm an AT&T guy, so it seems to be here. I'm going to do a test right now from my basement office in St. Louis Park. It seems to be fairly prevalent in the Twin Cities, especially to the core cities, and in some of the commerce corridors of like to Duluth or to Rochester. But I really think, look, it's going to be a balanced equation for providers to say, where are we at with adoption and new customers? And I think that some of it's been expedited in the last year because people have been using their phones more as hotspots. They have been required. I also represent the folks who do the property managers and apartment owners in the state. And what I could tell you is that those people applying for rental assistance are some of the people who only have a phone as their access to the internet. And they are challenged to upload documents or interact in a more sophisticated way, which then is a barrier to them receiving the rental assistance they are due because of the pandemic. And so that's where I think this idea of access and actually like a functioning access and a functioning speed and a functioning technology is probably the next conversation, because ultimately we'll keep fighting about speeds for a long time, but until we can figure out how to pay for it for everybody, it will be like every other issue. It'll just be a budget battle. But I do know that it will probably be a part of whether it's 5G or other technologies, because picking winners and losers is always hard. But I do believe that the infrastructure that Congress is debating right now, that bill will have unprecedented dollars for high-speed access and broadband throughout the country, whether it's urban or rural or other underserved areas.
Well, our local cooperative here crowed about how last year they had plowed fiber into a rural area. But if you looked at the actual math behind the whole thing, it came down to like, if they'd have to have everyone sign up out there, of which not everyone would, and then it would be like the cost was like $2,000 per customer just to plow it in. And how do you justify that in a economic way?
Well, that's the challenge. You've found the exact issue that is why it isn't being deployed more widely. And if it's $2,000 per customer, and then for a co-op, their math isn't as, it doesn't require to be as sharp as a for-profit publicly traded company, right? They can figure that out over 10 or 15 or 20 years, whereas the public company needs to show that payback in a much sooner time frame. So that is the quagmire of the cost of deployment, the cost of customer acquisition. Where do you get the revenue to pay it off in the long term? And I think co-ops have a model that has proven to work pretty well. I talked to somebody yesterday that has a Emily telephone co-op as their provider. And this is somebody who lived in Minnetonka, now lives in Corcoran, executive in town. And because Emily did put fiber to the homes in where his cabin is, he recently moved from Minnetonka to Corcoran. He now has faster service at his cabin than he can get in Corcoran. So this isn't, urban. It's not always urban, rural. It just depends on where you are. A provider promised me fiber here 4 or 5 years ago. I still don't have it. I could pay to get it, but frankly, my cable provider keeps upgrading their service in such a way that the faster I get, the exponential cost isn't that much higher. So I just keep increasing my bandwidth through them, and they don't seem to need to, drop new cable. They're just figured out a more efficient way to move packets.
Are you seeing more municipalities trying to take up the ISP service?
I'd say less overall. I think there was a big push over the last 10 years of people, but they've mostly failed. They've mostly gone bankrupt. I live in St. Louis Park. They tried a whole wireless system. Solar powered wireless 15 years ago, failed. Minneapolis has really struggled. The city subsidizes their wireless network. Competitors have been able to come in and cherry pick neighborhoods and customers based on socioeconomics, have been doing well. But I think there'll be a strain going forward on municipal finances for, if it doesn't start in the next year, it'll start in 2 or 3 years. And so I think those capital projects will be more and more challenging.
I just was reading recently, Ohio is trying to put in some laws saying that they want to ban municipal ownership completely in that state.
Well, I think you have to look at where they have succeeded and where they haven't succeeded. And that's why I point to the co-op model. I mean, that would tend to say that model's better than municipal ownership, just because of the capital outlay. But obviously the phone and cable companies do not want municipal ownership. It's a direct, attack on their business model. And then you have the government competing against the private sector. But if you think about other public utilities like electricity, those models have survived, and there's a lot of people who equate the need for broadband and high speed to the need for electricity. But I think we're probably a little ways away from policy catching up to that argument.
Blois, you mentioned you have cable for internet, And my experience with that is reliability is lousy. Between me and the head end of the cable company, there's probably 500 electrical connectors in there, and any one of them failing is the failure of the system to me. And recently I moved over to fiber, and as you know, fiber is welded together, so there are really no connectors. And so for me, many miles of fiber line has been 100% reliable.
I appear to be in a fortunate location next to the cable head over the last 7-8 years. I would say that overall we're in good shape here, and I have, I do pay a premium commercial level service so that I'm guessing I get prioritized because, I chose to have a home office 7 years ago, and that the funny thing was though that when I signed up for it, they told me my installation was going to be about $300 more than traditional installation, but my equipment costs were the same, and I kind of pushed back a little, and I said, so what is it? What is this extra installation cost? And it was just very clear that since I was asking for commercial level service, they knew they could charge me more for an installation, because I said, isn't the same person going to hit the same switch or two switches back and why do I get charged more? And we went back and forth a little. I think they brought the price down a little, but no, I totally understand that. And like I said, I could get fiber here, but we've been good. But I would say that, the next big house project, if there is one, we would do that. The one thing I have found is that I've installed a more sophisticated mesh Wi-Fi system. And that has helped immensely with streaming on 5 TVs, and at any given point 3 to 5 laptops or desktops. So I'm always pretty happy with our capacity here because it does pretty well even with cable.
So I had a
go ahead,
question.
Joe.
Just it's years ago now, power companies were looking at sending data over electrical lines, and that just kind of disappeared. I didn't know if there was any more innovation push in that realm, because everyone's got power to their buildings. So that was kind of the idea.
I have not heard anything new about that. I would say I think that there's 2 factors there. One is due to their strict regulatory environment, I think the capital would have to come from somewhere else probably before to invest it outside of the existing grid. And then 2 is, I think there might be a gentleman's handshake per se between incumbent telcos and power companies to say, we'll stay out of your business if you stay out of ours.
Okay. Well, quite frankly, from an engineer's standpoint, BPL, broadband over the power line, is a flawed technology. In my mind, it's amazing that it even works and creates all kinds of RF noise throughout the spectrum. They had to exclude putting any noise in the AM broadcast band because broadcasters so much complained, but they put it elsewhere on the amateur radio bands.
Well, and I think it's interesting you say that, Mark, because it's not going to change anything, I think, in the near term, but it'll be interesting if there's any push for this, because we've all become less picky about the quality of our broadcasts since the pandemic. It doesn't mean we should, limit them or go backwards, but at CCO, what we get away with for broadcast quality now, that we would never even, and the listeners don't seem to mind. So it's an interesting, and if you think about TV, we were talking about this the other day, how common it is that people, with a bad Zoom, are doing TV interviews, even though they can go back out and do it in person with much better coverage now. So.
Is there, one of the points been hearing around the country is, copper being abandoned and moving to fiber, and is there a push in the industry for more fiber to go out to the rural areas, as we basically are being told, or our copper is being kind of neglected because certain providers are like, well, we don't care about it anymore anyways, we have to take care of it, we don't have to take care of it very well though. Is there a push for fiber to go in everywhere then, or especially talking about getting broadband out to rural locations?
I think
even here in
copper
the
will
city?
be. I think copper will be abandoned for further investment, pretty quickly over the next 10 years.
Any other questions? No, hearing none.
Well, I want to thank you guys, but I also want to say that I think, as somebody who follows media and broadcast and lives in it, thanks for always doing your best to make us sound good and be better, because I have a great appreciation for that with the engineers I've worked with over the years. And then second is, I do think it's one of those pieces that, like everything, when people don't know about it, they don't know about it. So whatever you need to do to help people understand who you are and what you do and the importance that's out there, I think is still critical. And hopefully you guys can find a way to build knowledge with people who need to really understand who you are and what you do over time, because unfortunately, I think, like many things, you guys are doing all your work behind the scenes and people don't even think of it if they don't know about it. So thank you.
Thank you, sir. Really appreciate your
Have a
time.
great day.